reading today, responsive reading, is number 594. It'll be up on the screen, or if you'd rather, it's also in the back of your gray hymnal. It's Principles and Purposes for Us All, and it's adapted from the Unitarian Universalist Association Principles and Purposes. Go figure. I'll read the dark if you will follow with the italicized. We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person.
We believe that each and every person is important.
We affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations.
We believe that all people should be treated fairly.
We affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth.
We believe that our churches are places where all people are accepted and where we keep on learning together.
We affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning.
We believe that each person must be free to search for what is true and right in life.
We affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process.
We believe that all people should have a voice and live out the things that concern them.
We affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all.
We believe that we should work for a peaceful, fair, and free world.
We affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part.
We believe that we should care for our planet Earth.
Thank you. Well, this morning, again, it is my pleasure to introduce Reverend Jean Morrow. And she is representing Hand in Hand, and this is our congregation's gift to Hand in Hand. So, welcome, Jean.
Thank you. I think I'll use this one. The sound is very good. That's okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's such a pleasure to stand in your pulpit. We have been good friends for a long time. My church that I just retired from, Spirit of Peace, and All Souls have been buddies for years and years and years, and it predates my coming to Sioux Falls. So it's a delight for me to be here. I am here instead of Tunisia Islam, who was called out of town. She was originally your speaker. But again, my privilege to be here. I like being with you. Before I begin my talk, I want to offer a poem called Home by Orson Shire, and the opening two lines are, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." And when you read articles and things about immigrants and immigration in America, those two lines are often quoted. The poem is very long, and so I'm doing excerpts from it. It's also very raw, and I didn't know if there'd be children here or not, so I will just read excerpts from it as way of introduction. Orson Shire is a Somali poet who lives in London now. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. The boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factories holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you. No one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains, beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck, feeding on newspaper, unless the miles traveled means something more than a journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten, pitied. No one chooses refugee camps or detention centers. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of a gun, and no one would leave home unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave your clothes behind, crawl through the desert, wade through the oceans, drown, save, be hungry, beg, forget pride. No one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave. Run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here. I was married to a wonderful man. He was thoughtful, loving, well-mannered. He was from Vermont. So he had a New England reserve about him that could be wicked fun. And he was a great dad, the patient, teaching kind of dad. But he was no saint. And one of the places he would have struggled on his sainthood application was how he felt about other people's children, particularly in the early play date years with our preschool daughter, Lizzie. We moved to seminary in Berkeley, California when Lizzie was 3 years old. And you couldn't survive in Berkeley, California without stepping into the complicated, complex play date practice. Rick didn't want to be the parent for play dates. He dreaded it. He didn't like how other people's children behaved. He didn't want to have to watch them. He didn't want to have to engage them. He just didn't like them. Or at least that's how it seemed to me. And this led to, of course, a family brouhaha, technical term, right? Because setting up and trading play dates was a thing. It was a thing in Berkeley, California. I'm sure it's a thing here, but it definitely was there. And as a seminarian, my life was pretty demanding, and I needed him to be part of this sometimes awkward, complex system. Finally, I stumbled on an interpretation of our situation that seemed to help. He referred to them as other people's children. And I said, I'm sure very frustrated, there is no such thing as other people's children. If they are in our care, they are our children. We love them and we take care of them like they were one of our own. Now there was something about this perspective that turned the light bulb on for Rick, and he proceeded to reframe his understanding of his role with other people's children. He had never babysat, he didn't grow up with nieces and nephews, and frankly, from a babysitting perspective, he didn't know what to do. But he absolutely knew how to be Lizzie's dad, and began to relax into that role with other children. By the time we moved back to South Dakota, he had the play date thing down cold. He could even initiate play dates. Well, I'm a firm believer in there is no such thing as other people's children. Society and culture has set up a system, at least in the United States, that we generally honor. I focus on raising my child while you focus on raising your child. But when we break through our societal norms, we adults, we know that we are all responsible for all children. Simple as that. If a child is in need, if a child's social system or family system has broken down, it isn't someone else's problem. That child needs assistance, and if you're able, you assist. Of course, part of the reason I hold this belief is because of my faith. I could go all Christian on you and say, Jesus loves the little children, or we are all God's beloved children. I could talk about our connection in a theological, rather disconnected, first world way, but it's deeper than that. My faith tradition, like yours, tells me that it is far deeper than that, our connection to each other. We are one. We are part of a web of life, as you might say. We're not separate from. We are intertwined within. All it is. What happens to one happens to all. So when I say there is no such thing as other people's children, I mean this in a deeply personal, visceral, primal way. I read once that pediatric nurses can distinguish the sound of a child crying. Let's say you're out shopping with your friend who's a pediatric nurse and you hear a baby crying. A tried and true pediatric nurse can tell if the baby is hungry, tired, sick, or mad as hell. The crying that really gets their attention is if a child sounds hurt or in pain. The child in need. In that case, a pediatric nurse may not be able to help him or herself from stopping to take a listen and then turn and head in the direction of the child in distress. That reaction, that's the kind of deep, personal, visceral sense that I mean when I say we are all one. What happens to one happens to all. There isn't such a thing as other people's children. This morning I want to tell you about children in South Dakota who are greatly in need of us to come to their aid. They need help. I also want to tell you about and invite you into a project that's working hard to address this need, hand in hand. And we frankly need your help as well. So first let me tell you about the children. They are unaccompanied immigrant children and youth, mostly from Central America, who crossed the border from 2012 to 2016, with the greatest surge arriving in 2014 and 2015. There are tens of thousands of unaccompanied immigrant children and youth living in the U.S. And it is estimated that 69,000 unaccompanied minors came across our border in 2014 alone. Most came across the Guatemala-Mexico border and then the Mexico-US border. Most of them came on foot at least part of the way of at least a 3,000-mile journey. Most turned themselves into the border patrol seeking asylum. Most were from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. They came because of the terror related to gang violence, human trafficking, drug trafficking, not to mention extreme poverty, food instability, and lack of educational opportunities. According to UNICEF, as of 2014, El Salvador and Guatemala had the highest and second highest rates of homicide among children aged 0 to 19 in the world. Globally, Honduras is one of the most violent countries due to gang violence and had the highest homicide rate in the world as of 2012. That kind of violence creates quite a picture. Can you even picture growing up with that much violence and threat around you? And can you imagine parenting in that environment? The issues related to border enforcement and immigration adjudication are dense and complex. I don't claim to understand all the complexities, and I certainly don't know how to solve the variety of issues that immigration reform presents. And I do know there are strong feelings about how we should proceed as a nation at the border. I get that. But for today, I want to focus on this particular group of unaccompanied immigrant children and youth who are already here. Upon presenting themselves at the border, these children and youth were automatically entered into the federal immigration court proceeding system. They were placed in detention centers, and if a sponsoring family could be found, they would eventually be sent to live with that family. Sponsoring families are usually relatives or sometimes people from their home villages who are already here. Now, according to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, we, South Dakotans, have about 300 unaccompanied minors in South Dakota with absolutely no one, no program, no system of support to serve them, nothing. Their path to citizenship looks like this. So just take for a moment, those of you who are parents or grandparents or have siblings or interact with kids. Imagine this is your kid in a country where they don't speak the language. This is the path to citizenship. The government sends a letter to whatever address they were released to, directing them to appear in an immigration court, which for kids in South Dakota is in Minneapolis. The first hearing takes approximately 5 minutes and is held for the purpose of establishing a court date. This scheduling meeting is something that we actually can accomplish here in Sioux Falls now. So if we can get the kids to Sioux Falls, we have a means of Skyping that first hearing that just gets them on the docket. Then between the first hearing and second, whatever that date is, the child or the youth has to put together all the paperwork for the actual hearing, and that requires legal assistance. So with this, an attorney's assistance, they gather up that paperwork and then they have to take the trip to Minneapolis. And they're required, the children and youth are required to appear there physically in court. So how does that work? For example, a 15-year-old Guatemalan who does not speak the language, living with a Guatemalan family who may or may not speak English, who may or may not be living in poverty here, are supposed to find an immigration attorney and also find transportation to get this youth or child to Sioux Falls for the first hearing, and then to immigration court for the second hearing. So again, can you imagine your 14-year-old taking this on? How about your 10-year-old? How about a 5-year-old? Some of these youth came across carrying younger siblings on their hips. Their arrival first got on people's radar through the school systems. These kids just started showing up. The schools turned to the immigration attorneys in the state, of which we have 7, I think. Our friend Tunisia Islam is one of the immigration attorneys who attempted to respond. She couldn't add 300 pro bono cases to her own practice, let alone get these kids to Minneapolis and back. So she worked with an organization in Minneapolis called Advocates for Human Rights to bring in trainers to train South Dakota attorneys to help these kids. 50 attorneys in our state were trained, I think in 2015. Only a half dozen have actually taken a case pro bono. Now, I had the chance to listen to one of the attorneys who has done a couple of these unaccompanied minor cases, and she said the learning curve was incredibly steep. Federal immigration court is a very different beast than what she had experienced doing in South Dakota courts. She said prepping each case was extremely time-consuming, depending on where the child was coming from, why they were coming, and collecting documentation. It's probably understandable that attorneys are not quick to pick up these cases. Though a very good effort, the train the attorney strategy did not work. So now there is a local organization that is taking a different approach to reach out to these kids, hand in hand. But I have to take a step backwards and talk to you about its parent organization. In December of 2017, an intersectional group of people came together to form South Dakota Voices for Peace. And you may have heard of it because Mike Huber is a member of the board, one of your members. Earlier that year, during 2017 South Dakota legislative session, 2 anti-Muslim, anti-refugee, anti-immigration resolutions and one such bill were introduced into the South Dakota legislature. At that time, Tunisia Islam was contacted by lobbyist friends of hers at the state capitol, and they were looking for help in fighting Islamophobia and bigoted legislation against immigrants. So she organized immigrants, refugees, Muslims, and people from the interfaith communities to go to Pierre to be present and heard during committee testimony. From this beautiful, dedicated group of people, South Dakota Voices for Peace came into existence. Now, the mission of South Dakota Voices for Peace, in case you haven't heard about them, is to empower South Dakotans with accurate information to fight Islamophobia and anti-immigration bigotry in order to nurture informed, inclusive, and civically engaged communities. That's South Dakota Voices for Peace. So last summer, amidst the tragedy of separation of families at the border, this exciting project formed out of South Dakota Voices for Peace. A handful of people, of which I was one, developed, as you might guess, it all had its beginnings, its seed in a coffee shop. I believe we were at Caribou. It was an interfaith group at Caribou. Anyway, we came together and eventually came to this initiative, this project called Hand in Hand, Justice for Immigrant Children. A couple gatherings later, we had a purpose and a case statement. This is our purpose statement: to provide advocacy and legal representation to children in immigration court because children deserve legal representation and are not capable of representing themselves, period. So Hand in Hand is an alliance of about 30 people from all sectors of Sioux Falls, business and education, therapists, different faith traditions, retired people, college kids. We began meeting in August to build a network to assist these kids. Our strategy is threefold. First, we are raising money to hire an immigration attorney whose focus will be these cases, serving children in need. This attorney will be hired by South Dakota Voices for Peace and will be supervised by Tunisia, who is an immigration attorney. The next two strategies won't happen unless we accomplish that first one, hiring an immigration attorney. So the second strategy is finding these kids. Once the federal government releases them from the federal detention centers to their sponsors, they aren't tracked. We know that there are about 300 children released to South Dakota. We also know that immigrants move around, they go where the work is. So we could have 200 children, we could have 500 children, we don't really know. But they are here. We know this from the school systems, we know this from Caminando Juntos and outreach of the Presentation Sisters into the Latino immigrant communities in South Dakota. And we also know this through the ELCA Latino Church here in Sioux Falls, Pueblo de Dios. We have a really good network to find the kids, I think, or at least to get the process started. I do hope you stay for the circle conversation because Olympia, who's here also from Hand in Hand, is a teacher in our school system. So she has a first-hand look. She's a fluent Spanish speaker and has a first-hand look with these kids. The third strategy is to establish a network of people who would be willing to drive children and youth to Minneapolis for hearings at their own cost, at the driver's cost. We are currently working on developing a partnership with Advocates for Human Rights in Minneapolis to have attorneys from their organization actually shepherd the South Dakota children into and through immigration court. And so if we can get the kids there, an attorney could take them into court. So through the relationship Tunisia has already built with that agency, they understand the predicament we're in, and we're trying to figure out how we might actually work out a partnership. So that's kind of it. That's Hand in Hand. I've been a part of this since the beginning, since the brainstorming. So I've been very attuned to how these kids are viewed. It's not uncommon for people to ask why I'm so invested. Why do I care about illegals? Why I care about other people's children, which is rarely said that way, but comes in other ways. As in, they shouldn't be our problem. Those other people should be taking care of their own children. Or these kids are being used as pawns so their parents can get citizenship. You know, you can hear all that. But for me, they are our children, they are my children. My faith tells me that we are one family. We are related in this interdependent web of life. When someone cries out in need, we should all stop to listen and then turn and head in that direction. And so, my friends, the purpose of this talk was to explore, educate, and inform, and also to invite. I want to invite you into this project. You certainly are invited in the fundraising effort. I'm prepared to receive checks, which I guess this probably is, cash. I even brought a little square card reader if someone has a credit card that you're hot to give some money to Hand in Hand. But I also want to invite you into the project, if this resonates for you in any way. If you have a heart for children, if you have a heart for immigrant children, if you speak Spanish, if you're a great grant writer, if you have fundraising ideas, if you have flexibility in a car with a full tank of gas, whatever you have to offer, I am positive there's a place for you in Hand in Hand. So consider yourselves invited. I'm also hoping you will consider becoming a spokesperson for the faith perspective that there is no such thing as other people's children, grandchildren, cousins, nieces, nephews, brothers, or sisters. There is no such thing as other people's children. My friends, in closing, may we answer the call to love all of our children, especially those who are crying. May it be so for you and for me. Amen.